Hello, one and all, boys and girls, and welcome to our yearly review of the Call of Duty series, the ups and downs of the most famous FPS ever made to date. And, like a lot of other people, I don't really give a much of a shit about the Call of Duty series overall. I'll check it out when it comes around every year, but I really have no expectations from it out of anything. These games are never made with any creative intentions or really any guaranteed ideas behind them. If they don't have one, they'll just scrap together the old formula and make another game. Because these things are just products that get thrown onto the market every year, but even with my disdain in mind for the series, Cold War was the most interested I'd been in Call of Duty for years. Being the first AAA game to be set during the Cold War made me think that it had some legs that it could actually stand on. Maybe an interesting story to tell, especially since Treyarch went through the painstaking effort of recreating Ronald Reagan for the intro and the trailer to give the game some quote-unquote authenticity. So, with some potential idea and possible ideas behind Cold War, did it ultimately stack up? When you fire up the campaign in this year's Duty, you get hit with an odd screen, a character creation menu, where you can choose your character's backstory and name, along with a couple other customizations and some character models. It's a new twist for Duty, since they usually just dole out a few already made characters across the story with names you'll never remember doing bland things for 6 hours. So, getting to actually make your own shooter character was a nice sign that maybe this year's COD would actually go somewhere. Ironically, Cold War's potential fell downhill pretty damn fast after the Ronald Reagan intro, as you begin to realize you're playing just another story about taking down a fierce cabal of the Ruskies/communists so that they can't throw down another WMD de jure at the planet in order to ensure that you save everybody from a fiery death. It's the same Call of Duty formula that's been in like the last 7 games. A bunch of fantastical warfare set pieces, shooting sections in foreign nations against relatively adept enemy AI, and if I cared to contrast any of these homogenized games to each other, I'd say that the Cold War probably has a half-decent shot at being one of the most difficult COD games in a while, but that's like saying which brand of flour is the most edible out of the bag. I barely have the energy to devote half a paragraph to talking about COD's gameplay at this point. It's the standard suite of guns, scopes, and regenerating health and cover that's been perfected to a damn science over the last 15 years. Treyarch is usually the better of the two developers, so I actually have higher standards for them, Black Ops 4 be damned. But the first half of this game seemed to be more or less just running the standard COD game, which is understandable since if COD tries to do literally anything out of the ordinary, the internet unleashes an oddly vocal amount of backlash and preventing this series from progressing to anything as interesting as Black Ops 3, so that's fun. They tried to add a couple of bells to Cold War, the optimum example being the attempt at some side quest additions with optional objectives. You're given some dossiers regarding some powerful members of the communist syndicate you're up against, and you can gather intel from across the game that will allow you to answer some questions in the dossiers that'll allow you an advantage throughout the game after you take them out. For me, the attempt at side questing in Cold War fell completely flat since it requires backtracking to find intel so you can have a good chance at actually answering the questions, which sounds crazy tedious, and at the end of the game, even though I failed every single one of these side quests because I just really randomly guessed throughout every question, and you don't get a do-over, it ultimately doesn't even fucking matter. The only thing the side quest affects is whether or not you get a finger wagged at you during the ending for fucking that up. None of this affects the gameplay or the progression, and I have no idea if the rewards are even worthwhile. It's a COD game, so I'm just going to imagine that you don't get to unlock any crazy powers or abilities from them, so what's even the frickin' point? There's only like 3 or 4 of these quizzes available throughout the entire game, so I could honestly just give 2 shits about that, but it's a new thing that it does, so I have to mention it for transparency's sake. And to be even more completely honest, even with those side quests in play, and even though I did fuck them up, the campaign is still a little bit less than 6 hours long, so even then it didn't add all that much. The rest of the game is just typical fare. You're in a boilerplate story that sounds like some middle-of-the-road Tom Clancy wannabe crap, where the communist nation has produced this cabal of terrorists that need to be tracked down as they're an international threat to pivot the Cold War tension, so you'll need to go to a place to track down a person, some files, or whatever else, following these breadcrumbs until you figure out what the big bomb is going to be this time. It turns out that the big scary group called Perseus has acquired the ability to set off the bombs that were installed throughout Operation Greenlight, a apparently US idea to seed Europe with many neutron bombs that'll allow America to nuke strategic parts of the continent in the eventuality that they'd be taken over by hostile governments, which sounds like the perfect plot point from one of these modern warfare books, but also realistically is the dumbest absolute dumb shit plan you could ever come up with for seeding your ally nations with active explosives that can apparently level entire cities. The plan is moronic, but Perseus has acquired the codes to detonate those bombs, and it's going to be a race against the clock to figure out where Perseus is actually hiding out after we shoot like the top 2 of 3 people that are running this whole thing. Thankfully, Treyarch was actually hiding a card in its sleeve, and it's the interesting story writing that keeps me betting on this developer. It turns out the reason why our character was customizable this year and we wrote his dossier as the player was because he had been liberated and brainwashed by the American team he's been working for so that they can use psychotropic MK Ultra crap to get intel on Perseus, the team that he used to work for. One of their missions went completely south, and Perseus abandoned him to get picked up by the American team. So this results in a prolonged pseudo-torture scene where your old partner straps you to a gurney and begins hurting you for the final location of the Perseus leader. This gameplay section was actually pretty damn good, since the protagonist has to flashback and relive the scene where he knows where the enemy base is, and because the main character is so drugged up and fricked out, the interrogator is so unhelpful on the same level that they have to repeat this section over and over again to get the correct information. This section begins corrupting over time, so you'll start seeing impossible geometry, memories plastering over themselves, and pseudo-horror stuff that is really the staple of games like Layers of Fear. The sort of unique missions that made Black Ops the high point of Call of Duty's tenure, but nowadays might make this game look incredibly cheesy and low bar. After going through a land of horrible visuals and swearing from our so-called friend, Perseus' location is finally found, and you can begin the final mission. And here's where things get slightly interesting again. After this revelation, you are given a choice of final mission to do. Basically ending buttons, because what else can you really expect from a Call of Duty game trying to do a moral choice? You can either betray your team or help them to save the world. The first time I did this, I absolutely betrayed the Americans because they kidnapped and erased your past, just because it was convenient for them at the time, and then you are put through a short mission where you cap all of the main characters in the head and begin working for Perseus again, and the game cuts to black as the bombs go off in the distance. The weird thing was that even though this is an available option, a huge majority of COD players did not pick it on Xbone. To do that is actually a rare achievement, so I guess the Call of Duty player base still has a tiny bit of humanity to itself. I mean, you can make out of that what you will. I just thought it was incredibly strange that that was the case. The other ending is your typical end of the terrorism stuff where you track down the leaders through many gun battles and defuse the codes and save the day, becoming one of the Americans' best helpers, and begin your new life in the States, brimming with job satisfaction. Apparently, the effects of MK Ultra-styled past erasure is something that you can just immediately get over with a harsh dose of truth and a reality check to the face.
You know that, kid. Heroes have to make sacrifices. That's why when I ask you for one more, I hope you understand. It was never personal.
To be brutally honest here, outside of the couple of interesting things that Treyarch adds to the mix this year, Cold War is just another entry on the long string of COD games that are, while being well made and developed expertly for optimal fast-paced shooting, it's simply more of the same and expected. A shooter series that pushes no boundaries and goes to no interesting locales, has nothing interesting to say or do, an entry that exists for the unenviable task of keeping a multiplayer server farm full of players until the series dies out in 30 to 50 years. Cold War is definitely closer to boring Blops 2 than the sparks of creativity found in Blops 3. I really thought that the Cold War setting would be the optimum time for Treyarch to pull some new gameplay or story beats from the box to stick in front of us in AAA fashion, but I really should have realized that the setting would be a simple excuse to regress backwards to shooting Ruskies all day every mission. These games always make a half measure of changing things up, like Cold War's maps being really big compared to other games. They're not completely straightforward. Really, beyond that, there's not much else, and I'm starting to remember, like, the Modern Warfare reboot, where it was still boring, but it had a range of mission types, and I don't think Cold War really has that. The side quest idea is dead in the water, since they didn't tie that to any meaningful gameplay changes, and the set pieces and plot points are there simply to reinforce the typical hunt down the WMD mission that's been the constant for the last 13 years of this series. I don't expect anything out of Call of Duty nowadays, since this series is so high profile that any major change to it would invite nothing but ridiculous backlash, and Activision Blizzard will kowtow to that backlash because the entire structure that's holding this up has no creative bones left in it or any visionaries to take the reins. This series is such a conga line of people coming together once every 3 years, has a big meeting about how to make the same formula again, and then they move on to their little cubicles and office to make more of the same, and they add nothing to society other than another big bucket to dump our extra time into. If nothing else, Cold War has taught me that even when a trailer inherently has those sparkles of uniquity to it, it'll ultimately get drowned out immediately by corporate backpedaling and homogenization to keep it profitable. At this point, if another good game ever gets made by the Call of Duty teams, it's going to be just by a sheer accident at this point. None of these games are ever set out to make a mark on the world, and so they never do. You do the shooty bang bang until the game tells you to stop, and then you stop. Game goes on a shelf to never be played again. Hopefully next week we'll have a better project to come to the plate, so I guess that's gonna be all for now. Have a victory for gamers, everybody, and thanks for coming to the yearly COD review.